Welcome to session 1, From Doom to Delight. We know that many of you are excited about some of the technical pieces of this course. In this first session, we're looking at a lot of the mindset that gets us to this place and how we can set the conditions for great teamwork going forward into some of these challenges. Dave, over to you.
Yeah, we've been given at this moment a chance to really rethink and reimagine. We think of the narrative that we're hearing across Canada in terms of faith properties, of aging congregations, declining membership, lack of mission, deferred maintenance on our buildings, budget shortfalls. So we're living into this narrative that really has us caught up in doom.
It's so common, isn't it?
It is so common. And we have this moment to pause and to really envision our buildings not as a liability, but as places where joy and connection and beauty, cooperation can be found. Spaces where we can really weave this fabric of love and care in the neighborhoods that we're in, this path of a new story to emerge. But the problem is we're story-formed creatures. So we have to create a narrative and a story that helps us live into this mindset that we're in. So when we're always thinking about doom, when we're always thinking about what story is actually happening on the ground, it's hard to imagine what reimagining could look like.
That's right.
So we're stuck. We're stuck in this mindset. Again, in being story-formed creatures, stories shape us. It shapes us in how we imagine the world, within a family system, community, institution. Those shared experiences, those stories become collective assumptions, boundaries, ways of believing that create a sense of security. So what stories do in a doom narrative is they pop up and we think, we got a budget shortfall. We've got this, building maintenance that is, taking so much time and energy, and we're stuck in that narrative, and it creates a limiting mindset. Cycles of shame, fear, worry. So when we meet with the Jeffs and the Janes, they're stuck in this story of fear, of I don't know what next could look like.
We often meet the church treasurer who says, I've been presenting the same document for the past 10 years. The numbers just get worse and worse.
Yes.
And it is, isn't it, Dave? It's not only the numbers, it's that feeling of shame and the sense that the story is repeating that we have to get out of, isn't it?
Yes. And it's this narrative where in the cultural moment we're in, the reality is people are not coming back on a Sunday morning.
No.
Like if we sit here on a Saturday night thinking, tomorrow morning, that's when they're coming back. So our narrative needs to shift.
They're all going to join the choir.
Right.
The flower team's going again. The organist will come back even if we're not paying him.
Where our budget's going to increase. So we sit in what's not real. The reality is that we're stuck trying to live into a past script, not a new one. And there is so much hope if we can go through the journey from doom to delight. So I'm just going to walk you through just a few steps. And I think there's some key shifts that you within your board or your leadership team, property team, can go through as you think about how do we shift the narrative that we're living into. The first one, phase that I think is we're sleeping. And that really is, or we're stuck. And that really is what we see when we walk into congregations. And by sleeping, I mean you're stuck in a destructive imagination. As we just said, you're worried about the budget. Are people going to come back? What about the young people, the young families? We're ruled by worry. We have this limiting mindset where we can't imagine what new could ever be, which causes us to get stuck in complacency. So there isn't this sense of hope, renewal, reimagination. There really is this sense of I'm stuck.
And the delight part's coming in this session, right, Dave? This is the hard part. This is the doom part,
This
right?
is the doom part.
Do you remember, we had one fellow who, because this conversation happens when Jeff or Jane, you go back and you have that cup of tea after the church board meeting with your spouse. And this is how it goes, isn't it? You say, it was so hard being in that meeting.
Yes.
We had one fellow who leads a business school, and he had to tell us, he said, guys, I just need half an hour to just tell you how hard these meetings are for me as a business professional.
Right.
It's hard, isn't it?
It's hard.
And it's hard for the people who are grieving.
Hard. It's lament, it's grief, it's loss, it's pain. What was isn't. And we need to be able to sit in that collectively together.
We do, because if we don't, And that's our point with this part of the session.
Yep.
If we don't sit in it, this part will come back to bite any good thing that you plan after.
That's right. We need to sit in what's real. And what's real is things need to shift.
Yeah.
They need to change. And it starts with the stories that we're telling ourselves. The next path out, so how we get out of that doom narrative.
I'm glad we're going to get out.
Is we're getting out. Come on. The way out is this awakening, meaning that truth is starting to set in. We're owning what's real. We're listening, not just to our congregation, but we're actually listening to the community. We're getting outside of ourselves a little because there's good happening in our neighborhood. There's good happening all around us. There's beauty that is going on within the not-for-profits and the business leaders and the imagination that's going on in our communities. We need to begin to do some experiments. And by experimentation, I mean take some risks and just do something. We don't know what next may be, but if we stay stuck, we'll never know what next is because we're only living into the worry and the fear. But what if we actually risked?
So one example of a risk is we said to one congregation, what if you run an event just for your grandchildren? Listen to what their dreams are. That was an easier way for them to say, we're not so sure if we can trust the neighborhood, but maybe we could trust our grandkids.
Yes.
Maybe that's a start.
Yep.
But the exciting thing in this journey from doom to delight is as hard as it is for you, it's not that hard for those in the neighborhood. They have that hope.
That's right.
And they can be a source of energy
Yes.
for you. And the converse is also true. If you exclude the neighborhood, that's a theme you'll hear throughout this course. If you exclude the neighborhood, all good things will be held back from you. And this is the place to begin, right at the start.
That's so good, Graham. In this kind of owning truth, I was sitting with a minister who was talking about how they were not in a doom narrative. And I said, oh, what makes you think you're not? And he says, well,
is that like the Monty Python skit where the guy
Yeah.
says, I'm not dead?
I'm not dead. Right. No, that's exactly what it was. I'm not dead. And I'm like, oh, can you tell me why you're not dead? And he says, well, we're 190-year-old away from dying from a crisis. Meaning, you've been in a crisis for probably 10 plus years.
Yeah.
But you're sitting in this doom story and can't actually see this awakening, the light bulb moment. You have to get out of that, not waiting for something to die before you realize you need to change.
Yeah.
Sit in what's true and begin listening, begin experimenting, allow for sparks of change to bubble up. And then when we do that, we then allow a new story to emerge. Because now when we risk, when we're doing experimentation, when we're living into something different, we allow for this story of hope. We're now curious again. We're now living into the delight mindset that says, oh, it's not really as bad as I thought because I'm now not stuck in this mindset of worry and fear. I'm experimenting, I'm listening, I'm curious, and we allow now a new story of hope to emerge.
And let's pause for Jeff or Jane here, okay? Because sometimes Jeff or Jane come into that situation and they knew this before, right? They knew that this board has consistently been making bad decisions.
Yep.
We sometimes have this terrible phrase, it is terrible, but it's true, we have found, that when a church is presented with 20 different options of what to do with its property, it has an amazing and consistent ability to choose the least good of those 20 options. So when Jeff or Jane comes into this situation, he's thinking, this is emotional stuff going on, we just need a plan. Let's put the plan through. And I think we would agree that plans and information are a key part of getting out of this emotional challenge. However, if there's a consistent track record for your church's board on killing good ideas, why do you think that your idea is going to kill this emotional challenge? What we're saying in this session, in some ways we're taking a bit longer on something we're not always that comfortable in, is saying this is the place where the best things happen and also where the worst things happen.
Yes.
And in some of the group exercises with this course, we're going to try to help you identify some of these places where we're stuck or we're trying to get out of that. And just presenting good news, just presenting delight over doom, it just doesn't work. That's not a journey from grief. So Dave, how do we get to delight?
Yeah, how do we get to delight is by asking new questions. And a congregations that I've
There,
worked
there are
with,
right questions, aren't there? There are
are.
wrong questions and there are right questions.
Yes.
Are we going to say that?
Yes, there are wrong
We are.
questions and the right questions. So churches and congregations love asking what I call church questions. And church questions are not compelling. They're not imaginative. They're not moving us to a delight narrative. They're questions that you get when you sit. I don't know what your thoughts are about sitting in committee meetings and property discussions, but it's questions like, what about the pews? How do we change the liturgy? Should we keep the choir or not? Do we have to change our style of music? In asking these questions, members assume that everyone wants the same kind of thing. We're not living into what does actually the community need? What are the longings and dreams and desires of my neighbor? We're asking these questions, looking around, going, how do we get back to what was? And that's not going to get us forward into how do we, deal with the deferred maintenance on our building and kind of duct tape things back together. But we're not asking the questions, how could our space actually be an asset to the neighborhood in which we're in? So we get stuck in the story and the narrative because our questions keep us there. Yeah. They keep us stuck. So the way out is to ask different questions, which I would call neighborhood questions. Because the reality is our neighborhood is alive and awake with possibility. And if we could ask the questions that move us away from how do we get more young people, how do we grow Sundays, how do we increase the budget, how do we get more people in the choir and serving in committees, that's not going to get us to the place that we need to be.
This is hard for those listening, right? Because all the questions you just went through, for some church boards, you just covered 90% of every discussion they've had for the last 10
every
years.
meeting. Yes. So what if we measured impact in a different way?
Yeah.
What if it was less about how do we get more young people? And again, when you ask the question, you get stuck because we don't know how.
Yeah.
We don't know how to leverage our buildings for impact. We don't know. So we're stuck spinning in a question that just has us walking into more and more doom.
In the next session on the director's responsibilities, we're going to look specifically at what are the objectives of your congregation. And some of those questions can inform this middle stage from doom to delight. Begin asking, well, then what is our purpose? Do we want to use language of gospel or church or Jesus? Any of those questions to ask to what extent are we doing well at what we hoped to do are questions which we believe are going to bring you out into the neighborhood, where all of those questions will be asked.
Yeah.
How are we doing, but with those neighbors? And in this session, looking at delight, we want you to be thinking about your property and thinking about how those neighbors are going to feel that sense of delight from the decisions you make. So, Dave, what does delight begin to look like?
Yeah, so just to say one thing too, that we also have a dominant cultural narrative that also has us stuck in doom. There are narratives of colonialism, systemic racism, financial inequities, environmental, that we see in our world. So we see narratives that inform doom. And when we begin to get out of that and go, what would a different world look like? What would a different way of being look like if we actually lived into a story of care, kindness, belonging? What if we actually held space for those who are on the edges? Whose voices are we not listening to? What is our building? What could it be used for? Questions around what are the cracks and crevices in my community that maybe our space could fill?
You know, I remember the first time walking down the street wearing a clerical collar in Montreal. And when I used to live in England, that was something, you were the neighborhood pastor, it was a great thing to walk around. In Montreal, it was a bit different. And actually the visible sign of the church brought forward all of those stories.
Yeah.
And in some ways, isn't it the case that when we represent a church property, we have something visible that even if we aren't involved in any of those narratives, we've done everything we can as individuals.
Yeah.
The place that we steward actually can bring some of those narratives into the community.
That's right.
And it's a hard burden to bear.
It is.
But it's one that if we bear it honestly and we're open with the community, they can help us journey through that as well. In the short version, these steeples sometimes are the emblem of colonialism in the community.
Of pain and trauma. So we need to own the cultural narrative of pain and trauma and not just our own. And that's the reality that we're sitting in. So when we ask the different questions, we're more curious about what possibility could look like if we lived into a new story. The new story emerges when we begin then to actually measure different things. So right now, obviously, in congregations, we measure budget, we measure how many people are filling the seats. But I don't think those are compelling measurements, especially with the cultural moment in which we're in, and the atrocities in which the church has participated in its colonizing narrative. So to move out of that, we get to begin to look at what would new measurements look like. What about, a really good friend of mine was having me think about a new measurement in which I could live into in my community. And he says, Dave, instead of thinking about how many people come on a Sunday, what if you ask the question, how many people are you bumping into in your week in your community? Yeah. How many bump-in moments are you having within your neighborhood? And when I started, so in a week, I was counting, and by the end of the week, I got to like 4. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. I thought I knew way more people in my neighborhood. And so I started going out into my neighborhood and kind of, hanging out in places. And when I would see someone, walk by, I'd pop out and go, hey, how you doing? And I began to intentionally bump into more people in my community. And when that happens, those bump-in moments create sparks for connection. Next thing you know, they're coming over for dinner that night, or you go and have a coffee together. You're hearing the story of what their son or daughter is engaged in. Or those moments of connection begin to create this sense of community. And what if we did that collectively as a church? So those are just little simple things that if we were engaged more in the right measurements, what could a different measurement look like?
We have 2 principal measurements that we often share with those we're working with. The one that Dave's referring to, these bump-in moments, used in another term, in an urbanistic concept, they get known as incidental meetings. It's the basis of a lot of the public library argument that's made around North America. And it makes exactly the case that Dave made from an urban planning point of view. Our favorite measure is looking at the reduction of rent cost from the market rent for charities and nonprofits who are trying to do good things. It's a bit of a view into the rest of the course, but to say, how are we practically benefiting those organizations? Even if we may not make the whole journey into all of the good works that they're doing, one of the things we can do with our space is reduce their cost of occupancy by sharing our space. These are the kinds of measures that come into this situation. But again, if we are not journeying from doom into this delight, into measurable delight, any good measure can be wiped out by that.
And just a practical story of that, even where we're meeting and the Godspeed, who's actually producing this with us today, Thomas's story was that. We had a space and we wanted it to be a community space. He was launching his business, needed, again, as a Black-owned business owner, to have space to launch something that you can then imagine what next could look like. Came in and began doing the work out of a shared space together. Awesome. And now he's got his own space and living into his dream as, I think, one of the best branding marketing firms in the city.
Amazing.
So you have those stories now where you just are holding space to incubate the dreams of those in your neighborhood. What does it look like to measure vibrant spirituality? What does it look like to measure creative architecture in the environment, in the built environment? What does it look like to measure financial sustainability, social community impact? Those are the things that we're most interested in if we look at measurements. And when you get into those kinds of questions, measuring something different, I think delight might emerge. Because now it's not showing up on a Sunday and going, there's only 20 people here this Sunday. But you're looking out with a larger view of what's going on in my community and how are we an asset? How are we part of a larger ecosystem of what is actually happening within our neighborhood? To close this off, we started with this doom story. Stuck in fear, worry, shame, not able to imagine what new could look like. The pathway out of that is one of risk, one of experimentation, one of asking different questions, asking, what are we measuring? And moving into what I think is a very exciting future, one of delight.
Here's a question. Is the script that got us here, the story that got us here, is it a good story or is it a bad story?
Yeah, well,
Because Jeff and Jane want to know that, right? They got their reputation to deal with.
I think
Am I part of a good story here and am I leading it to a good direction, or is this thing lost?
I would frame it this way. I think Jeff and Jane, because of the doom narrative, we're storytelling creatures. They need to tell themselves internally that it was a good story.
Okay.
So because we're storytelling, we got to create a narrative that says it was good. And we got to get back
We're
to
going to get back to that.
We got to get back to that because it was good.
Okay. So that's an immediate problem for anybody who's Black, Indigenous, gay.
100%. So the question is, it was good for who?
Yeah.
So it was good for a very select group
So we got a
of
problem right away.
white, male, affluent men.
Yeah.
The system or the script, we need to convince ourselves in the pain in which we're feeling that the story was good and we got to get back to that. The only way to heal is to say, no, it actually wasn't good. It wasn't always amazing. Yes, maybe we lived in a dominant narrative where Christianity was at the center of that story. Yeah. So people were coming on a Sunday in a different way because it was part of the community narrative.
But they have good memories, right? It's the place where they came of age. They remember being treated differently in the youth group from where they were in the kids group, right? They were in the scouts.
Yeah.
They remember being part of those things. So there's many, many happy memories of these places. But it depends where Jeff or Jane want to go here, right?
Yeah.
Do they want to go back to the harder story of European Reformation and separating from the Catholic Church and leaving to find the New World? And because those are actually all challenges though when it comes to financing, right?
Right.
Because if we're going to the granting foundations and the municipalities and the provincial federal governments, we have to be willing to answer for that. And it's one of the big reasons that all of the above don't want anything to do with the religious context.
Yeah.
So if we want to tell the story of this place could have such, in the future, could have such amazing community impact, one option is we pretend it was always great, right? Like we remembered.
Yeah.
Or we're honest about this really went wrong and we're making reparations. This is an act of reconciliation.
Yeah, I think the only way to move forward into a reimagining is to heal the past story.
Yeah.
Here are the ways in which we as the church have done harm.
Yeah.
Here are the belief systems and structures that have been put in place that actually have marginalized, have oppressed. Own that part of the story so that then you can actually live into the new or different story.
So From Doom to Delight is actually a session that Jeff or Jane wish they didn't have to do.
For sure. They would rather just go, no, it's fine.
Let's just get the offer from the developer and that's it, right?
And here's the thing, nostalgia's a bitch.
Yeah.
Nostalgia will have you so stuck in what you think was good.
Yeah.
And have you actually not sit in the reality of the pains in which are also within that.
And nostalgia would be fine if it just took the nostalgic people to solve the problem. But if we're going to need outside stakeholders to find a solution here, we are going to have to at least be able to begin talking about this stuff.
Yeah. Again, when we look at the church as a colonizing presence, it loved being the center of the village, the center, biggest building, where everyone gathered. But whenever we're the center, whenever we are at the top of power, we really miss impact. You can use the word gospel impact. Because if you look at the story in which Jesus came, he surrendered all power and became low,
nothing,
less than nothing. And I think this is a beautiful moment because what we actually have that can happen is when you remove yourself at the center and you now become a spoke, a part of a larger community ecosystem. You're bumping into, you're relating, you're engaging with others who are doing really good work.
And isn't it the case that so many churches are approached by people in their community who will say to the church, you don't understand Jesus.
Right.
You don't understand.
Right.
Jesus would never put his name on a sign in front of this thing and build a building to himself.
Right.
You know, they've read Jesus 101 in university.
Yep.
They've done a YouTube video of who was Jesus. And then they look at what the church is doing and think, you clearly have nothing to do with this guy, right? So the gospel mission may even begin from that prophetic voice from outside, helping the church realize that over at least 1,700 years of the development of the church, maybe even 2,000 years, the church in some ways has filled itself with power and inadvertently become less like Jesus as they fill themselves with more earthly power.
Right.
So this moment where there's a humbling of these buildings, where they're literally falling down stone by stone, they're all in deficit, we all look like a bunch of losers, may actually be a far more Christ-like position to be in if we could embrace it and realize the community wants to come to us as vulnerable, broken, and be with us in that place. And if our response is to always say, no, we're fine, everything's fine, we're the church, we're the fill in your blank church, what kind of church we are, right? So gospel mission, to me, this state of great concern could be more Christ-like than anything we've experienced in generations. The other is, what does gospel mean if not freedom from oppression, freedom from the control of everything that's bad in the world? To begin to show that delight. And what is the tapestry of delight? You know, what does it look like when this is actually happening? To me, I remember one of the first times we had the circus show at St. Jack's, and I kept trying to invite people to come and see this because you know, I wanted them to come and then explain to them. And there was one guy from a big foundation, I really wanted him to come. Basically to prove to him, look at all these community people who are, you know, using our space. Forget about the church, but wouldn't you like to help these community people? And he kept not answering my invitation. And then one day I was in the church was filled with young people. And I looked over and I see this guy at the bar of the circus show buying himself a gin and tonic. I was like, I'll buy you a gin and tonic. And actually delight for him was he wanted to come on his own. He wanted to see it for himself and experience not as the hosted, honored guest, but just as one amongst many. And actually the delight was, it was really happening. It was happening, and it was better for him to experience it that way. I'll tell you another tapestry of delight kind of story. I remember coming into St. Jack's and all of the normal house lights were off. And it was a particularly gray day. And all of a sudden, out from behind the side of one of the walls came these 6 guys with very long beards and really big turbans. And I had no idea who they were. And I thought, who are these guys in the church? And it turns out they were volunteers from the refugee charity. They were Syrian men who were performing in a play that they were putting on to explain how difficult it was for them to leave Syria and the conditions by which they left. And they wanted to black everything out in order to then turn on the lights and explain what was going on. But just seeing them begin to tell their story, I mean, they turned off all the wrong light switches. At first I was a bit annoyed. And I realized they're able to tell their story in this place, which came from completely different roots than what we had normally done.
Yeah, and I think what happens is many churches that we meet with will say, oh, so this is what's going to bring people back on Sunday. And I'm like, no, stop. If your whole goal in doing anything is to try and get people back on Sunday, you're missing the point. The whole point is to be part of a larger community ecosystem. Be part of the love and care in your neighborhood. It may, but that's not why I'm doing something. I'm doing something because I want to extend the love in which I have been given to those around me.
It's awesome.
And to receive the love in which they have. And it's a giving and receiving. It's reciprocal. It's not just come to my thing, which has always been the narrative for the church. And I think now we have this moment to say, no, we don't actually have a thing. And if we did have a thing, I don't want you to come to it because it's not a very good thing. What I want is to be part of what we're doing collectively together.
We had one of the circus artists in the circus at St. Jack's. She said to me the other day, she said, I was watching this TV show, Graham, and we've had, as you know, Dave, we've absolutely come to the understanding that many people will come to our church for circus performance. And we don't expect them to see them on a Sunday. There are many more Francophones that are part of that. Our church is more Anglophone, although is to some extent bilingual. But she'd been watching a TV show, and somehow there were descriptions about Anglicans and Presbyterians and Catholics. And she said, so what are we here?
Right.
And I thought, it was such a
Right.
powerful question.
Oh, it's beautiful.
But what are we is, and she felt she is fully part of the church because
Right.
she's
And
she's
what
an
if
artist
we
there.
expanded our view of church? So we think church would happen on a Sunday. What if church
that's
is what's
exactly
going
it.
on and all that's
Can you
happening?
imagine if I had said to her, thanks for the question, but don't you know, you aren't actually
you're not
part of
part
the
of it.
church.
No.
You're just here for as an artist.
Open up your concept of the church in the neighborhood.
Yeah.